They now begin to urge me to take to the stump. I will pause a while before I consent. Yet, on many accounts, I would be glad to do so, if it were the custom. James A. Garfield, Diary, August 10th, 1880. When I was asked to participate in a symposium in July, sponsored by the Warren Harding Presidential Sites, the questions that came to my mind were, who came up with the idea of having James Garfield speak to groups from his front porch? And when was the idea proposed? Was the idea consciously planned? If it were the custom, taking to the stump, meaningful words. Throughout most of the 19th century, presidential candidates did not take to the stump, advocating their merits to be the next president of the United States. Such self-promotion would have been considered undignified and improper. When William Henry Harrison actively took to the stump in 1840, he was accused of a blatant disregard for tradition. The Advertiser, a Cleveland newspaper that favored the sitting president, Martin Van Buren, bellowed, "When was there ever such a spectacle as a candidate for the presidency advocating his own claims for that high and responsible station?" Old Tip, William Henry Harrison, gave 23 speeches. Curious crowds gathered to see the potential president. He was criticized for saying different things to different audiences and for using the personal program, I, to excess. His speeches were 1 to 3 hours long, about the length of this talk today. But yes, Harrison won in 1840, but active campaigning remained suspect right up to the nomination of Republican James A. Garfield in 1880. In 1880, James Garfield was an at-large member of the Ohio delegation at the Republican National Convention, which met at the Crystal Palace in Chicago between June 2nd and June 8th. The leading candidates for the nomination were Ulysses S. Grant, the former President of the United States, Senator James G. Blaine of Maine, and the Treasury Secretary John Sherman. Garfield was pledged to Sherman, and on June 4th, he gave the speech nominating him. The balloting took place over the course of 2 days on June 7th and 8th. The party was divided. Many had been looking for an alternative for weeks, if not months. And for many, that alternative was James Garfield, who was fully aware of this. After 2 days and 33 ballots, neither Blaine nor Sherman nor Grant could prevail. On the 34th ballot, 17 delegates from Wisconsin voted for James Garfield. This was not as spontaneous as it seemed. Even before the convention assembled, the Wisconsin delegation had planned to throw its weight to Garfield if it appeared that the convention was deadlocked. It was. The Wisconsin delegation did. And 2 ballots later, on the 36th ballot, James Garfield was the compromise candidate of a divided Republican Party. And I will note that this convention in 1880 is the longest convention in the Republican Party's history, 36 ballots to nominate a candidate. 2 weeks later, on June 24th, Garfield's Democratic opponent, General Winfield Scott Hancock, was nominated on the 2nd ballot at the Democratic Convention in Cincinnati. Also nominated for the presidency in 1880 were Neil Dow of the Prohibition Party and James Weaver of the Greenbacks. Each of these candidates made the one customary concession to publicly acknowledging their candidacies, a letter of acceptance sent to the parties that nominated them, but also published in newspapers nationwide. James Garfield's letter, published a month after the Republican convention, covered the issues: restricting Chinese immigration, reforming the civil service, promoting a balance of trade through a moderate application of the tariff, maintaining a separation of church and state, and recognizing the supremacy of the national government over the states. The letter of acceptance was the only active public declaration of a candidacy and the only public and published expression of a candidate's views on the issues of the day. Thereafter, candidates were silent about politics in public forums. Mr. Garfield scrupulously avoided making any public comments that could be seen as touching on his candidacy or current political issues. A few examples illustrate his conscientiousness on this point. When he spoke at the dedication of a Civil War soldiers and sailors monument at Geneva, Ohio on August 3rd, he said, "Ideas are the only things in this universe that are immortal. We build monuments to them. We hold reunions not for the dead, for there is nothing on all the earth that you and I can do for the dead. They are past our help and past our praise. We can add to them no glory, and we can give to them no immortality. It is to commemorate the immortality of the ideas for which they fought that you assemble today and dedicate your monument that points upward towards God." Nothing here in these words touched politics. Every word was meant to convey a moral point. At a reunion of the Army of the Cumberland, he said, "I am sure there is not one of you here tonight that does not feel the inspiration of the evening, does not recognize that you are better, brighter, tenderer, and truer for having sat here the last hour and heard the strong words of Union sentiment. It becomes us to gather these glories into our hearts." Here are the words of a man of thought and feeling, not the words of a presidential candidate. That made those words acceptable, even though everyone knew that the Republican nominee for president was the speaker. In researching the question, how and when did a more direct appeal, a front porch campaign, come about, I considered what sources to consult. I used 4. 3 of them from the Garfield papers: letters, telegrams, and his diaries. The 4th source was contemporary newspaper accounts between June and October 1880. These sources reveal that Garfield followed tradition until nearly the end of the campaign, scheduling other politicians and longtime local associates to travel to various critical states, especially to Indiana and New York, to speak on behalf of himself and the Republican Party. It was in September, and late September at that the first Front Porch Campaign sprang into being. So source 1, the 1880 diary. There are no entries in James Garfield's diary from June 2nd to June 24th. There is nothing about the convention or his activities after he came home from it. The entries for August and September and October were more useful, and we'll get into that as time goes on here. Source 2, letters to Garfield. The correspondence Mr. Garfield received was varied. For example, on June 10th, James R. O'Byrne informed Garfield that he was soon leaving for Indianapolis to make arrangements for an Irish Republican convention that would promote the Garfield-Arthur ticket. We expect to add a large recruit list to the Republican Party and shall work night and day to do it. If we carry New York and Indiana, I think we are safe. But it is necessary to do that at least. Garfield agreed. T.C. Boyd, recalling the just ended Republican convention, T.C. Boyd wrote from Chicago on June 12th. And if you've ever come to the museum and heard this in the audio in the visitor center, you'll understand it, but here it is. June 12th. I want to inform you, when you came to the passage in your speech of asking who we wanted for president in your presenting Mr. Sherman, I was the first man that replied to you that we wanted Garfield. Another letter, John W. Martin of Port Deposit, Cecil County, Maryland, wrote to ask that James Garfield accept the congratulations of the colored people of this county and to assure him of our heartiest support. Other writers asked for an autograph or a photograph, and these were supplied. In his mail, James Garfield received invitations from around the country to state and local fairs, memorial dedications, and Grand Army reunions. Mr. Garfield exchanged letters and telegrams with Marshall Jewell and Stephen W. Dorsey, the chairman and secretary of the Republican Party, and with his running mate, Chester Arthur, an expert fundraiser. In the weeks immediately after the convention, raising money and arranging speakers was the focus of James Garfield's efforts. In this work, he cooperated with these and other Republican leaders. This work was designed to win states like New York, Indiana, Ohio, Connecticut, and New Jersey, all northern states and all critical to a Republican victory. Source 3, newspaper articles. Many newspaper articles appeared in June and July about Garfield's family and farm. On June 14th, the Chicago Tribune reported, "If ever there was a happy family, it is General Garfield's in his pleasant Mentor home." His mother, Eliza Ballou Garfield, was a central figure in the accounts of Garfield's domestic life. Although some articles referred to her as Mrs. Garfield, others employed a warmer, more affectionate, more familiar term, Grandma. On June 16th, the Cleveland Leader reported that Grandma Garfield, as the family and neighbors call her, brought up her children in the doctrines of the Church of the Disciples. And of her son, she said, "I never knew anything mean about him." In the June 22nd Brooklyn, New York Eagle, Grandma was described as cheerful as a cricket, while the July 10th issue of the Morning Times of Oakland, California reported that Grandma Garfield is a woman of unusual energy, faith, and courage. Of the 5 Garfield children, Molly, Harry, and James R. made the press most often. It was reported that the boys, students at St. Paul's School in New Hampshire, received testimonials for their schoolwork. Harry won the prize for Best English Declamation. Molly was featured in an article in the Kansas City Journal on June 20th. Molly's room has 3 windows, a closet, and is plainly but neatly furnished, and shows indelible marks of the good but girlish taste of its occupant. Molly absolutely protested against going to live in the White House. She preferred to live either in the farmhouse in Mentor or in their house in Washington. The same June 22nd Brooklyn Eagle that covered Grandma featured an article on Lucretia Garfield, who was described as a lady perhaps a little under the medium size, but very well made and very well proportioned, weighing perhaps 135 pounds. She has a well-produced face, all its features being expressive and harmonious. Her manner is a little shy, and she has a marked and cheerful laugh, a sense of the humorous and of her own dignity, and overall, a cheerful, happy nature. Newspaper portraits such as these burnished James Garfield's reputation as a much-loved and affectionate man with a supportive family. The Wisconsin State Journal was among the many papers nationwide that reported in June a triumphal arch has been erected near the depot at Mentor, one side of which was inscribed with the legend, "Our Townsman, James A. Garfield, 1880," and the other with, "James A. Garfield, Ohio's favorite." Later that day at Painesville, Garfield was present for the dedication of another soldier's monument. In his remarks, he kept to the expected standard that a presidential candidate should refrain from politics at a non-political event. "I know you have come today not for my sake. It is not becoming to me to speak, nor shall I speak one word touching politics." After James Garfield was nominated, newspapers covered the attacks that were immediately made upon him by the opposition. His political missteps during the late 1860s and early 1870s, involving three scandals, Crédit Mobilier, De Gaulle Your Pavement, and the salary grab, were again dragged into print. For instance, citing Crédit Mobilier and De Gaulle Your Pavement, the Boston Post on June 9th reported that while Garfield was a man of more intelligence and capacity than President Hayes, he was also more corruptible. On June 23rd, the Indiana State Sentinel charged the Boston Advertiser with hypocrisy for accusing James G. Blaine of corruption, but defending Garfield's denial that he never owned, or received, or agreed to receive any stock of the Crédit Mobilier or of the Union Pacific. In response to charges published in Harper's Weekly that the Democrats were campaigning dishonorably, Charles Dana, the editor of the New York Sun, and I might mention a longtime opponent of James Garfield, editorialized on July 10th, "If anyone has invited a bitter and disagreeable, scurrilous campaign, the Republicans have done it by nominating such a candidate." James Garfield did not take those attacks lying down. Supportive newspapers refuted the charges against him with evidence showing his lack of malevolent intent. Surrogates addressed the scandals as they spoke to this group and that. For all his virtues, intelligence, scholarly achievement, bravery, kindliness, and fairness, James Garfield was not immune from attacks of political enemies who knew his record. Source 4, telegrams. The Garfield papers contained telegrams sent to James Garfield during the campaign. On the backs of many of them are notes written by himself. Most are in pencil, much faded over time. So it was an interesting challenge to manipulate Garfield's notes to be able to read them. Here's an example. You see this? And then after 5 changes of lighting and so forth and so on, we come up with what's on the right side of the screen. So as you can see, it says here on the top, "Have you made any appointment by Schurz," who was a senator from Missouri, "for the 6th? Answer quick, James A. Garfield." And then the bottom one, I hope you will accept the invitation, Republicans of Cleveland, Ohio, to speak for them in October. So there's General Hawley. But you see, I could read that after 5 manipulations on the computer. But again, I'll just quickly back up, but that's the original. So it really was a lot of fun to pull these up, and doing that led to what I thought was a real nice little discovery. But let's get back to this. Garfield's June telegraphic notes were in response to congratulatory messages or concerned fundraising for the campaign. To President Hayes, he wrote, "Accept my thanks for your kind message," acknowledging a rumor then circulating that Garfield had betrayed John Sherman in his own favor. The nominee wrote a note of thanks to Sherman for his kind message of support and insisted that his nomination was wholly unsought and unexpected. To build his ground game with surrogates and to raise the necessary money to finance his campaign, Garfield telegraphed Republican Party Chairman Marshall Jewell, Party Secretary Stephen Dorsey, and Levi P. Morton, the finance chairman. He approached railroads, financier Jay Gould, and oil magnate John D. Rockefeller for campaign contributions. He was directly involved in arranging speaking engagements on his behalf in New York, New Jersey, Indiana, and Ohio. Among his surrogates were James G. Blaine, Carl Schurz, Robert Ingersoll, Burke Hinsdale, Charles Henry, Don Pardee, Harmon Austin, and Edwin Cowles, publisher of the Cleveland Leader. These men were either nationally known associates or operatives in his congressional district. All of this was behind the scenes, out of public view. The candidate is not playing a public role here, he is working behind the scenes. Telegraphic messages between James Garfield and the writers of campaign biographies of himself, Josiah Bundy, James Brislin, and A.G. Riddle are frequently seen in the Garfield papers. There were 7 campaign biographies published on James Garfield in 1880. That was the most campaign biographies of a candidate up to that time. Many of them were later reissued after his death with the information about his presidency and his assassination. June and July were full of newspaper stories, letters, and telegrams indicating that a presidential campaign was underway. But nothing was happening in June or July on James Garfield's front porch. It was much the same in August. So far in this summer of 1880, Garfield's strategy and tactics were in keeping with those of earlier 19th century presidential campaigns, with speakers for both parties traversing key states and cities on his behalf. For the Republicans and Garfield, the key states again were Maine, Indiana, New York, Ohio, Connecticut, and New Jersey. For the most part, letters, newspaper articles, and telegrams in August are much like those of June and July. Garfield received an invitation from the city of Boston requesting his presence for the 250th anniversary of the settlement of that city. On August 1st, N.L. Thayer, a fellow disciple of Christ, addressing Garfield as "Dear Brother," wrote, "There was a man the other day who told me that your brain weighed 3 ounces more than any other on earth. I told him at once the reason of it was because every part of your brain had received a cultivation to that extent that it became heavy and strong and well balanced." James A. Gray, an African-American Civil War veteran, reported a meeting of 5,000 colored men in Charlotte, North Carolina, who felt they could give Garfield a 10,000 majority and win the state. And there was actually efforts made to win North Carolina. He didn't, but the effort was there. In August, the coming state elections in Maine, Indiana, and Ohio were uppermost in the minds of professional politicians. Party chair Marshall Jewell wrote early in the month that Indiana was looking well and Maine was looking very well. On August 15th, A.H. Markland, an assistant postmaster general, remarked in a letter to Garfield, "We must stake everything available in Maine. Every apostle of the cause and every appliance of a vigorous and determined campaign should be set to work." No one was thinking about James Garfield's front porch, though that was about to change. And here's where we come to another of these penciled notes that was very much faded, and this now you can read. Indianans were the catalyst for the Front Porch Campaign. On August 11th, the day after his diary entry about not taking the stump, James Garfield responded to a telegram from John C. Newell, the chairman of the Indiana Republican Party. He agreed to meet some commercial travelers from Indianapolis soon. "Let your friends come either August 28th or September 4th, he wrote New. This is the first instance in the Garfield papers that I found in which there was any reference to arranging in advance to meet a group of citizens at his home. But before the Indianans came the Maine state election. This was to be held on September 13th. It was the first test of Republican strength in the nation and a bellwether of the results in November. Republicans believed they would win Maine with a 5,300 majority. Garfield was hopeful, but if Maine should be lost, he confided to his diary, it will throw additional uncertainty into the future of the campaign. I want to mention, this is something I don't have in the talk, but one of the things that I came across in the research that I did was that there was serious talk in October that Garfield might be replaced because the election wasn't going as well as they had hoped up to that point. He might be replaced by General Grant. Of course, that never happened, but there was actually talk about that. All right. Maine Senator James G. Blaine was running the Maine campaign. And just days before the vote, he wrote to Garfield that his hopes were of the brightest character. Garfield biographer Alan Peskin noted Blaine was entirely unprepared for the unfortunate result. In a post-mortem letter to Garfield, Blaine wrote that the day before the election, the Democrats brought in $70,000 to buy votes. Garfield saw it differently. He perceived that there was an element of rebellion against Blaine and his autocracy. The margin of victory in the race for governor was tight, just a little over 200 votes for the Democratic candidate, Frederick Plaisted. Many Republicans, like W.H. Mason of Illinois, were despondent. The Maine loss was discouraging and will hurt us in Indiana. E.R. Branch, a prominent business owner in Painesville, took a different view. If ever there was a blessing in disguise, I believe the Maine election is one. The adverse news from Maine is just what was needed to make the sleeping lion in the Republican Party manifest in the putting forth of every possible effort to secure the final victory. Maine's outcome in September made the October results in the state elections in Indiana and Ohio even more important. D.B. Henderson wrote after the Maine election, "We must have Indiana." Claimed Indianan Seth Whitman, "The Democrats are leaving no stone unturned." And Ohio wasn't safe either. George A. Baker, a Garfield neighbor, called and gave me his views of the situation from the intelligence he had gathered from Democrats. He thinks Ohio is gravely threatened by an ambush like that in Maine. Meanwhile, James Garfield met those commercial travelers from Indianapolis. They visited the Mentor Farm on September 4th. He recorded in his diary that a company of 95 ladies and gentlemen from Indiana arrived by special train, having walked to the house from the railroad by way of the lane. If you've been on the historic site, you know there's the path that you walk up to the house by. Well, this is it. This is going north toward the railroad. So that's how it was in 1880. So they walked up that path. What were Mr. Garfield's remarks that day? He began, "Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I can hardly say that you have taken me by surprise, for I was informed some days ago that a party of commercial gentlemen from Indiana would call upon me today. But I am very pleasantly surprised at the large numbers of ladies and gentlemen who have honored me by this visit." Then he reviewed the favorable economic conditions of Indiana and Ohio. The magical power of human labor had conferred such blessings which have been secured to us, and I trust will continue to our children's children. Every stroke of the axe, every blow of the hammer, every turn of the wheel, in short, every effort of labor increased the prosperity of the American people. Concluding, he asked the ladies and gentlemen to accept my most cordial thanks for your visit. I welcome you to my house and to the kind greetings of my family. Preparations were now being made for a monster rally. That's the word that was used, a monster rally on September 28th at Warren, Ohio. The featured speaker was to be Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, offering brief remarks. Conkling had been the leader of the faction at the Republican convention to nominate General Grant for a third term. The Republican committee of Warren had suggested that Garfield should attend as a courtesy, but Garfield was concerned with propriety. He should not attend a clearly partisan political gathering. On September 21st, he wrote in his diary, "I think I ought not to go unless I am ready to take to the stump." Clearly, he was not ready. He repeated his view about the Warren meeting on September 25th and 26th, citing his conviction that he should not go unless he was prepared to be a more active candidate. He observed that I must keep myself from being too much absorbed in the contest. So I'm not going to go out there and talk politics. I'm not going to present myself as the Republican nominee for president at this clearly political rally. That's a wrong thing to do. He should not be personally involved in the campaigning, but James Garfield was being swayed in the direction of more contact with voters as a presidential candidate. If I could take the stump and bear a fighting chance in the campaign, I should feel happier. So he's thinking about this. What might I do? Little more than a week later, 400 members of the Young Men's First Voters, Garfield and Arthur Club of Cleveland, came by train and spent an hour. It was October 8th. I spoke to them a little while. It was a pleasant call. His brief remarks concluded with these thoughts. "Young gentlemen, your visit to me gives me a compliment of the highest sort. It still reaches the hand of youth out to me, which I take with all cordiality and earnestness, and I give you all the thanks of which my heart is capable." Still, it was Indiana now that was top of mind. It was the key to victory, and Garfield knew it. To win the biggest prize in November, New York, Indiana's state election had to be won in October. Stephen Dorsey, the secretary of the Republican National Committee, agreed. "It seems to me that the results of the whole campaign are centered in Indiana and Ohio." Many speakers and much money were being poured into Ohio and Indiana. Garfield received final assessments on the prospects in the two states. It was concluded that the Republicans would win Indiana by 5,300 votes, a tight majority, a tight win, but a win. 3 days later, Indiana was won by just that margin. Ohio was won by 20,000 votes. Letters and telegrams of congratulation abounded. Delegations of citizens, too, now eager to see and hear James Garfield, began coming to mentor. On October 15th, 2 days after the election, the Cleveland Republican Businessmen's Club also visited. Mr. Eli was the leader of this group. He made a speech to which the general replied, "You are businessmen of Cleveland, and that means a great deal. You are citizens of Ohio, and that means more. You are citizens of the Republic, and that means a great deal more. And in your threefold capacity, I greet you and thank you for this demonstration of your confidence." Then came 500 German citizens of Cleveland on the 18th, 500 members of the Lincoln Club of Indianapolis on the 19th. On the 25th, a delegation of 250 African Americans, 300 people from Warren on the 26th, 900 ladies from Cleveland on the 27th, all presented to Cretan Mother. On the 30th, 329 citizens of Youngstown, and 1,500 people came from all the towns of Lake County. What was the nature of the remarks Mr. Garfield made to these various groups? To the Germans, he remarked that it was the Saxons who planted their principles of Teutonic liberty in England. But I trust, fellow citizens, that you have come here to help us build a grander temple than the Cathedral of Cologne, made out of the hearts and lives, aspirations, and hopes of all people who have come to this country to make it their home. He included in his remarks a poetic selection in German, thus becoming the first presidential candidate in American history to campaign in a foreign language. And he concluded his remarks with, "Willkommen alle." To the African Americans who visited on October 25th, he said, "Of all the problems that any nation ever confronted, none was ever more difficult than that of settling the great race question on the basis of broad justice and equal rights to all. I congratulate you on the great advance which your race has already made under liberty. Whatever can justify or fairly be done to assure to you an equality of opportunity, it will always be my pleasure to do." Seen here are 2 pages of his brief remarks as published in Speeches at Home. To the group of 200 from Portage County who visited on October 28th, the Republican nominee greeted them with these words: "Ladies and gentlemen, if I should try at this moment to recall the memories which your presence awakens, I should be overwhelmed. Here are schoolfellows of 28 years ago. Here are men and women who were my pupils a quarter of a century ago. I see others who were in the regiment which I had the honor to command. How can I forget that 25 years of my life were so intertwined with the lives of the people of Portage County? I cannot forget while life and consciousness remain. Ladies and gentlemen, all the doors of my household are open to you. The hand of every member of my family is outstretched to you. Our hearts greet you, and we ask you to come in." Like the remarks made at Army reunions, Garfield's words did not speak to political issues. They were friendly, welcoming, philosophical, and uncontroversial. They were not consciously self-promoting. They were appropriate to a man running for president in 1880. The evidence suggests that the 1880 Front Porch Campaign evolved out of the many contacts Mr. Garfield made during the months between his June nomination and his election in November. It was not conceived ahead of time. It was not planned. It emerged spontaneously, a fortuitous outcome of months of interactions by letters, by telegrams, and perhaps in person. James Garfield's Front Porch Campaign occurred after the loss in Maine and after the victories in Indiana and Ohio. With wins in Indiana and Ohio, a national victory in November seemed assured. In October, citizens came to Mentor to see a likely president-to-be. Not until 1888 was a Front Porch Campaign again attempted. Benjamin Harrison took a page out of James Garfield's book that year. William McKinley and Warren Harding did the same in 1896 and in 1920. There we are, ladies and gentlemen. I'm done. I'm done, but not quite. I have one more story to share. It involves James and Lucretia Garfield and their farm. For me, it was the most exciting or the most fun newspaper article of all. The article recounted how Mr. Garfield's property got its name, Lawnfield. It was widely reprinted around the country for several weeks. Here is the version from June 23, 1880. A few friends of General Garfield's were assembled at his pleasant home in Mentor. A beautiful field of grain in front of the house on the other side of the road inspired a guest to ask if the Garfields had given a thought to a name for their property. After discussing several names, the group submitted to the general the name Lawnfield. General Garfield, however, preferred another name, Rudolphia, to honor his wife's maiden name. Mrs. Garfield objected, and as Lawnfield has the property been known locally ever since. So that is the real end of my talk. Questions, comments?
Well done.
Thank you. Yes?
I'm confused about, I thought all the states had their elections on the same day, so why was Maine so far in advance of the rest?
Again, these were state elections, not the national election. So they were electing governors local officials. And so in Maine and then again in Indiana and Ohio, they had the state elections before the national election. And those state elections were hints, right? They're again, bellwethers to, what's it looking like for November? It's the same, like today, is it New Jersey and Virginia have their gubernatorial elections in an off year, which is then supposed to give an idea of, okay, where are the Democrats and Republicans going to be in the next presidential cycle? So it's the same idea. But yeah, there was another question over here. Yes.
Did I just hear you say that the Front Porch campaigns were held at 4 Ohio homes?
4 Ohio homes, all Republicans, and all won.
So those are the only ones?
Yes. Yes.
No Democratic? Okay.
Nope. Not that. I've never seen anything to that effect. I'll put it that way. Other questions? Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming today. It was a pleasure giving this talk to you.